Cancer Ward by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Chapter 17. The Route from Esigcool. Vera Kornelyevna was worried about how Rusanov would take the full dose. She visited the ward several times that day and stayed late after work. She wouldn't have had to come so often if Olimpiada Vladislavovna had been on duty, as she should have been according to the schedule. But she'd been taken off, after all, to attend a course for trade union treasurers. Turgeon was on duty instead, and he was a bit too happy-go-lucky. Rusanov took the injection rather badly, although the effect did not exceed the permissible limits. After it, he was given a sleeping draft, so he didn't wake up, but kept relentlessly tossing and turning, twitching and groaning. Each time Vera Kornelyevna came, she stayed, watching over him and taking his pulse. He kept writhing and stretching his legs out. His face was reddish and damp with sweat. Without his glasses, his head no longer looked like that of an overbearing official, especially lying on the pillow. The few hairs that had survived his baldness were slicked down pathetically over the top of his head. Since she had come into the ward so often anyway, Vera Kornelyevna took the chance of getting some other things done as well. Podiev, who had been the ward's senior patient, was now discharged, and although the duties were practically non-existent, there was supposed to be one. She walked from Rusanov's bed to the next one and announced, "Kostoglotov, you are the senior patient as from today." Kostoglotov was lying fully dressed on top of the blankets, reading a newspaper. It was the second time Gangart had come in while he was reading it. She was, by now, used to his verbal sallies, and expected them, so she smiled at him lightly as she spoke, as if to imply that she knew quite well the appointment was meaningless. Kostoglotov raised a cheerful face from the newspaper, and, not knowing how best to show his respect for the doctor, drew up his long legs, which had been stretched out along the bed. He looked quite friendly as he replied, "Vera Kornelyevna, are you trying to deal me an irreparable moral blow? Administrators always make mistakes. Some of them even succumb to the temptations of power. After years of thought, I have made myself a vow never again to act as an administrator." "You've been an administrator. An important one." She was ready to talk and enter into the game. "My most important position was deputy platoon commander, but I really got further than that. You see, my platoon commander was so stupid and incompetent that they had to send him on a refresher course, after which they'd make him a battery commander, no less, only not in our battalion. The officer they sent, instead of him, was immediately transferred to the political department as a supernumerary. My battalion commander had no objection to my appointment because I was a good topographer and the boys obeyed me. So I spent 2 years as acting platoon commander with the rank of senior sergeant, from Yelets to Frankenfurt on Oder. They were the best years of my life, by the way. I know it sounds funny, but it's true." He realized he didn't look very polite, sitting there with his legs pulled up, so he transferred them to the floor. "There, you see," listening or speaking to him, the friendly smile never left Gangart's face. "Why refuse the job? You might have a few more happy years." "What wonderful logic! Happy years! What about democracy? You are ignoring the whole principle of democracy. The ward never elected me. The voters don't even know my life history. And you don't know it either, for that matter." "Well, tell me then." As always, she spoke softly, and this time he too lowered his voice so that only she could hear. Rusanov was asleep. Zatsirko was reading. Podyev's bed was empty now. Their conversation was almost inaudible. It'll take a long time. Look, I feel embarrassed to be sitting while you're standing. It's not the proper way to talk to a woman. But I'll look even stupider if I rise to my feet and stand in the passageway like a soldier. Sit down in my bed, please. I ought to be going, really, she said. She sat down on the edge of the bed. You see, Vera Korneyevna, everything that's gone wrong in my life has been because I was too devoted to democracy. I tried to spread democracy in the army. That is, I answered my superiors back. That's why I wasn't sent on an officer's course in 1939, but stayed in the ranks. In 1940, I got as far as the officers' training college, but I was so rude to my superior officers that they threw me out. It was only in 1941 that I somehow managed to complete a course for non-commissioned officers in the Far East. Quite frankly, I regretted it a lot, not being an officer. All my friends were commissioned. When you're young, you take things like that to heart. Still, even then, I thought justice was more important. I had a friend. He was very close to me, said Gangart, looking down at the blanket on the bed. He went through the same sort of thing. He was an intelligent and educated man, but he was never more than a private. There was a half pause, a moment of silence that passed between them. She raised her eyes. But you're just the same now as you were then. What do you mean? A private or intelligent? Independent. For instance, look at the way you talk to the doctors, especially me. She spoke severely, but it was a strange sort of severity, touched with softness, like all her words and movements. It was not a dim, diffused softness, but somehow melodic and based on harmony. The way I talk to you with the greatest respect. This is the highest form of conversation I know, but you don't realize that yet. But if you're thinking about the first day, well, you can't imagine what a tight spot I was in then. I was a dying man, and they only just let me leave the district where I'm exiled. I came down here, and instead of winter snow, it was pouring with rain. I had to take off my felt boots and carry them under my arm. Where I'd come from, the frost was really something. My overcoat got soaked. I could have wrung it out. I checked my boots in the baggage place and took the tram to the old town. I had an address there, one of my soldiers from the front, but it was dark by then, and everyone in the trolley kept telling me, "Don't go, you'll get your throat cut." After that 1953 amnesty, they let all the criminal scum out of the prison, and they can't catch them now, however much they try. I didn't even know for sure if my soldier friend was there, and no one in the trolley knew where the street was, so I decided to go round the hotels. They had such beautiful lobbies. I felt quite ashamed to walk into them the way my feet were, and one or two of them even had room. But when I showed them an exile's document instead of the ordinary passport, they all said, "No, we're not allowed to." Well, what was I to do? I was quite ready to lie down and die. But why die in the open under a fence? I went straight to the police. I said, "Listen, I'm one of your boys. Find me a place to stay for the night." They hemmed and hawed and finally told me, "Go to a tea house and spend the night there. We don't check papers there." I couldn't find a tea house, so I went back to the railway station, but they weren't letting anyone sleep there. There was a policeman walking up and down, chasing people away. Then in the morning I came to you, to the outpatients department. There was a line. They examined me and said I ought to be hospitalized immediately, so I had to go right across the city again, changing streetcars on the way to get to the Kommandantura. Although working hours are the same everywhere in the Soviet Union, the Kommandantura wasn't there. "Damn the working day," he'd said. He wouldn't stoop so low as to leave a message for the exiles. He might be back in the office, or he might not. Then it dawned on me, if I handed in my document, I wouldn't be able to get my felt boots back from the station. So I had to take 2 trolleys again, back to the station. Each trip took an hour and a half. I don't remember you having felt boots, did you? You wouldn't remember, because I sold my boots to a guy at the station. I reckoned I'd be spending the rest of the winter in the clinic and wouldn't live to see the next one. Then I went back to the commandantura. I'd already spent 10 rubles on trolley alone. From the car stop, I had to wade a whole kilometer more through mud in such pain I could hardly drag myself along, and everywhere I went I had to lug my duffel bag with me. But thank God, the commandantura was back. I deposited the permit from the commandantura at my place of exile with him, and showed him the admission chit I'd got from your outpatients. He marked up the permission for me to be hospitalized, so I came. No, not back here to the clinic. Not yet. First, I went into town. I'd seen a poster saying Sleeping Beauty was on. So you decided to go to the ballet? If I'd known that, I'd never have let you in. Definitely not. Vera Kornelyevna, it was like a miracle. I wanted to see a ballet for the last time before I died. Even if I wasn't going to die, I knew I'd never see a ballet in my perpetual exile. But damn it all, they changed the program. Instead of Sleeping Beauty, they were showing Agu Bali. According to the asterisk, Agu Bali is an Italianized Uzbek opera composed during the Stalinist years. With a soundless laugh, she shook her head. This dying man's venture into the ballet appealed to her, of course. It appealed to her strongly. What could I do? There was a graduate giving a piano recital in the conservatoire, but that's a long way from the station, and I knew I'd never be able to get even the corner of a bench at the hospital, and the rain was lashing down, really whipping me. There was only one thing to do: go and give myself up at the clinic. I arrived. There's no room, they said. You'll have to wait a few days. The other patients told me that sometimes people waited as long as a week. But where was there for me to wait? What could I do? Without the tenacity I'd picked up in the camps, I'd have been completely lost. And then you wanted to take my chit away from me, didn't you? How do you expect me to talk to you after all that? It all seemed rather amusing in retrospect. They both found it funny. There'd been no mental effort in telling the story, and all the time he'd been thinking about something else. If she'd finished medical school in 1946, she couldn't be less than 31 now. She must be roughly the same age as he. Why, then, did she strike him as younger looking than the 23-year-old Zoya? It wasn't her face, it was her manner, her timidity, her shyness. With a woman like that, one always wonders if she has yet. If you look closely, you can always spot them from elusive hints in the way they behave. Yet Gangart was married. Why, then? She looked at him, wondering why he'd made such an uncouth and unpleasant impression on her at their first meeting. True, he had harsh lines on his face and a dark way of looking at you. But he knew how to look and speak cheerfully, and like a friend, as he was now, for instance. Or, rather, he kept both styles of behavior at the ready, using either as the need arose. Well, I know all about felt boots and the ballerinas now. She smiled at him. But what about your ordinary boots? You realize your boots are an unheard-of breach of the rules. She narrowed her eyes. Rules. More rules. Kostoglotov screwed up his face, and his scar moved with the grimace. Even in prison, a man's allowed to exercise, isn't he? I can't go without my walk. I won't get better without it. You wouldn't want to deprive me of fresh air, would you? Yes. He liked walking. He spent a lot of time strolling along the lonely, remote pathways of the medical center. Gangart had noticed. He looked extremely odd on these occasions in the badly made women's dressing gown which he had begged from the housekeeper. The men weren't issued dressing gowns. There weren't enough. He gathered it under an army belt with a star buckle, pushing the voluminous folds away from his belly to the sides, but it still flapped open at the hem. He wore army boots, but no cap, and his shaggy black head stood out conspicuously as he paced along with great, deliberate strides, sometimes slowly, sometimes fast, looking down at the stones at his feet. When he reached the limit he had set for himself, he always turned back. He always kept his hands folded behind his back, and he was always alone, never with anyone else. Nizamuddin Bramovich will be making his rounds in a few days, and you know what'll happen if he sees your boots. I'll get a reprimand. Once again, it was not much of a demand as a request, almost as though she were complaining to him. The tone she used with him wasn't even one of equality, but almost deference. She was surprised, herself, that it had risen between them. She had never used it with any other patient. Trying to convince her, Kostoglotov touched her hand with his paw. Vera Kornelyevna, I give you a 100% guarantee he'll never find them. He won't even see me wearing them in the hallway. What about outside, on the paths? He won't realize I'm from his wing. I've got an idea. Just for fun, we'll write an anonymous letter denouncing me for having a pair of boots. Then he'll bring 2 orderlies in to ransack the place, and they won't find a thing. That's not a very nice idea, is it? Writing anonymous letters. She narrowed her eyes again. There was another thing bothering him. Why did she use lipstick? It coarsened her. It spoiled her delicacy. He sighed. People still write them, Vera Kornelyevna. My word, how they write them. And it works. The Romans used to say, one witness is no witness. But in the 20th century, even one witness is superfluous, unnecessary. She averted her eyes. It was a difficult subject to discuss. Where will you hide them? My boots? Oh, I can think of dozens of places. It all depends on the time of day. I might put them in the stove when it's not lit, or I might hang them on a string out the window. Don't worry about that. It was impossible not to laugh. He probably would manage to pull it off. How ever did you get out of handing them in your first day? Oh, that was easy. I was in that dog kennel where they make us change into pajamas. And I put them behind one of the doors. The orderlies collected all the rest of my stuff into a bag with a label and took it away to the central store. I had my bath, came out of the bathroom, wrapped them up in newspaper and took them along with me. They went on talking about this, that, and the other. It was the middle of the working day. What was she doing, sitting here? Rusanov was restlessly asleep, covered in sweat, but at least sleeping, and he hadn't vomited. Gangart took his pulse again and was on the point of going when she remembered something and turned back to Kostoglotov. Oh yes, you're not getting a supplementary diet, are you? No, ma'am. Kostoglotov picked up his ears. You will as from tomorrow, 2 eggs a day, 2 glasses of milk, and 50 grams of butter. What's this? I can't believe my own ears. I've never had food like that in my whole life. I suppose it's only fair, though. You know, I'm not even getting sick benefits while I'm here. Why not? Quite simple. It seems I haven't been a member of a trade union for the required 6 months. Consequently, I'm not entitled to anything. That's terrible. How did that happen? I'm just not used to life outside anymore. When I got to my place of exile, I should have known that I ought to join a trade union as soon as possible. Strange. He was so clever in some things, but so helpless in others. It was Gangart herself who had insisted on the extra food for him. It hadn't been easy either, but it was time to be off. She couldn't sit chattering all day. She was almost at the door when he called after her laughingly. "Just a minute. You're not trying to bribe me now that I'm a senior patient, are you? You've got me really worried. My first day on the job and I'm corrupted already." Gangart left the room. But after the patient's lunch, she had to visit Rusanov again. By that time, she'd learned that the senior doctor's rounds would definitely be tomorrow. This meant there was an extra job to be done in the wards. She had to check all the bedside tables, because if there was one thing Nizmutin Baramovich kept a zealous eye open for, it was crumbs or illicit food in the bedside tables. Ideally, there should be nothing in them except hospital bread and sugar. He would also check on cleanliness, and in that department he was more ingenious than any woman. Vera Kornelyevna went up to the second floor, and craning her head back looked alertedly around the tops of the walls and the ceiling. In a corner above Seggatov's bed, she thought she'd spotted a cobweb. There was more light now. The sun had just come out. She called one of the orderlies. It was Elizaveta Anatolievna. Somehow or other, she was always around in an emergency. Explained to her that everything had to be clean for tomorrow, and pointed at the cobweb. Elizaveta Anatolievna took her glasses out of her coat pocket, put them on, and said, "Good heavens! You're absolutely right. How disgraceful!" She put away her glasses again and went off to find a brush and a stepladder. She never wore glasses while she was doing her cleaning. From there, Gangart went into the men's ward. Rusanov was in the same position and running with sweat. However, his pulse had slowed down. Just before she came in, Kostoglotov had donned his boots and dressing gown, ready for his walk. Vera Kornelyevna informed the ward of tomorrow's important inspection and asked the patients to take a look inside their bedside tables before she checked them herself. "We'll begin with our senior patient," she said. There was no good reason why she should begin with the senior patient, or why she should have gone again to his corner of the room for that matter. Vera Kornelyevna's figure resembled two triangles set apex to apex. The upper one narrow, the lower one broader. Her waist was so narrow that one's hand itched to get one's finger around it and toss her into the air. But Kostoglotov did no such thing. He obligingly opened the door of his bedside table for her inspection. "Help yourself," he said. "Now, let's see." She tried to get to the table, and he moved to one side. She sat down on his bed, right next to the table, and began to look through it. She was sitting there. He was standing behind her. Now he had a good view of her neck with its tracery of thin, defenseless lines, and her hair, which was fairly dark and tied into a little knot at the back without the slightest attempt at fashion. Really, he ought to break free of this torment. It was ludicrous that every woman who came along should so utterly cloud his head. She just sat with him for a bit, chatted to him and gone away, but in the hours between, he couldn't stop thinking about her. While as for her, in the evening she'd be going home to her husband's embraces. He'd have to break free, but there was only one way to do it. With a woman. He stood there, staring fixedly at the back of her head. The collar of her coat was turned up behind, pouched out like a little hood, over which he could see the little round bone at the top of her spine. He felt like running his fingers around it. "Of course, your bedside table is one of the most disgraceful in the whole clinic," Gangart was commenting. "Crumbs, bits of greasy paper, shreds of dirty old tobacco, a book and a pair of gloves. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? You must clean it up today, all of it." He continued to stare at her neck and said nothing. She pulled out the drawer at the top of the table. In it, among some loose change, was a tightly corked bottle full of brown liquid, about 40 milliliters, a small plastic glass, the sort you find in traveling kits, and a medicine dropper. "What's this? Medicine?" Kostoglotov whistled under his breath. "Oh, it's nothing," he said. "What sort of medicine? We didn't issue it, did we?" "Well, I'm allowed to have my own, aren't I?" "Of course not. Not while you're a patient in our clinic, and without our knowledge." "You see, it's a bit awkward to explain. It's for corns." She started to twist the unlabeled, anonymous bottle in her fingers, to open it and sniff it. At once, Kostoglotov intervened. He clamped his two coarse hands onto hers and pushed aside the one, attempting to pull out the cork. This constant joining of hands which inevitably continues conversations. "Careful," he warned her, very quietly. "You have to know how to handle that stuff. You mustn't let it get on your fingers, and you mustn't sniff it." Gently, he took the bottle away from her. "Well, really, this is taking a joke a bit too far. What is it?" said Gangart, frowning. "Something strong?" Kostoglotov sat down on the bed next to her. His voice was businesslike, but quiet. "Extremely strong," he said. "It's a root from the Esigcool. You mustn't ever sniff it, either as an infusion or in its dry state. That's why it's so firmly corked. If you got some on your hands, didn't wash it off, forgot about it, and licked it later, you might easily die." Vera Kornelyevna was alarmed. "What do you keep it for?" she demanded. "That's tornit," Kostoglotov growled. "What?" "That's tornit. I don't know what that statement... I've never heard tornit. I'm guessing that means like that's my own business." "That's tornit," Kostoglotov growled. "Now you've found it? I'll be in for trouble, I suppose. I ought to have hidden it. I've been taking it for treatment. I still am, now and then." "Purely for treatment?" She questioned him with her eyes, but this time she didn't narrow them. She wore her most professional air. Yes, she was wearing her most professional air, but her eyes were the same light brown. "Purely for treatment," he told her, honestly. "Or are you keeping it, just in case?" She still didn't entirely believe him. "Well, all right. If you want to know, on my way here, I did have the idea in the back of my mind. I didn't want to suffer unnecessarily. However, the pains went and I gave up the idea. But I still carried on treating myself with it. In secret? When no one was about? What's a man to do if he can't lead his life as he pleases? If he's surrounded by rules and regulations? What sort of doses did you take?" "It's a graduated system. From 1 up to 10 drops, then from 10 down to 1, then 10 days interval. It's the interval at the moment. To be honest, I'm not convinced it was the X-rays alone that got rid of my pain. It might have been the root as well." They were both speaking in muffled voices. "What did you infuse it in?" "Vodka." "You did it yourself?" "That's right." "What concentration?" "Concentration. Well, he gave me a handful of root and said, 'This'll do for 3 half-liters of vodka.' So I worked it out from that." "But how much did it weigh?" "He didn't weigh it. He measured it by eye." "By eye? Poison like that, and he measured it by eye? It's aconite. Don't you realize that?" "Could be aconite or aconite." "It's aconite. Don't you realize that?" "What was I supposed to realize?" Kostoglotov was beginning to get angry. "You tried dying when you're alone in the universe, with the comment on Twitter not letting you out past the village limits. Would you start thinking, 'Ah, yes, aconite. What does it weigh? Do you know what the weight of that handful of root could have done to me? 20 years hard labor. for absence without leave from my place of exile. I went, though. I traveled 150 kilometers into the mountains. There's an old man living there called Krementsov, with a beard like Academician Pavlov's. He's one of the settlers who went there early in the century. He's an honest-to-goodness medicine man who goes out, collects the roots, and works out the doses himself. They laugh at him in his own village. No man's a prophet in his own country, but people come to see him from Moscow and Leningrad. Once a Pravda correspondent arrived and was convinced, they say, but there are rumors that they've clapped the old man in jail now. Some damn fools made half a liter of it and kept it openly in the kitchen. They had some guests in for November celebrations. The vodka ran out. The host and hostess weren't there, so they drank some of the root. 3 of them died. There's an asterisk next to November celebrations. On November 7th, the anniversary of the 1917 revolution. I think we've already had that asterisk earlier in this book, but the vodka ran out, and the host and hostess weren't there, so they drank some of the root. 3 of them died. In another house, some children were poisoned by it too. But why arrest the old man? He warned them. But by now, Kostoglotov had noticed that he was spoiling his own case, so he stopped. Gangart was upset. "That's the whole point," she said. "It's strictly forbidden to keep powerful substances like this in a hospital public ward. It's out of the question, absolutely out of the question. There could easily be an accident. Give me the bottle." "No," he said firmly. "Give it to me." She frowned angrily and reached toward his tightly clenched fist. Kostoglotov's strong fingers, which had seen so much work, were closed around the little bottle, completely hiding it. He smiled. "You won't get it that way." She relaxed her brows. "Anyway," she said, "I know when you go for your walks. I can take the bottle when you're not here. Thank you for warning me. I'll hide it." "On a string out the window, what do you expect me to do now? Report you?" "I don't believe you would. You've just told me you don't approve of denouncing people." "But you don't leave me any alternative." "Does that mean you have to denounce me? That's not very dignified, is it? Are you afraid Comrade Rusanov here will drink it? I won't let it happen. I'll wrap it up in paper and stow it away somewhere. When I leave the clinic, I'll want the root extract to treat myself with. I don't suppose you believe it works." "No, of course I don't. It's just a lot of dark superstition and playing games with death. I believe in systematic science, practically tested. That's what I was taught, and that's the way all oncologists think. Give me the bottle." Despite what he'd said, she tried to pry off his top finger. Looking into her angry, light brown eyes, he felt little inclination to dig his toes in and argue. He'd have been only too pleased to give her the bottle, and the whole of his bedside table, for that matter. But it went against the grain to betray his principles. "Oh, I know you're scared science," he sighed. "If it were all so categorical, it wouldn't be disproved every 10 years. What is there for me to believe in? Your injections? And by the way, why have they prescribed these new injections for me? What sort of injections are they? They're absolutely necessary. Your life depends on them. We're trying to save your life." She spelled it out with particular insistence, her bright eyes with faith. "And don't imagine that you're cured. Can't you be more precise? What effect will they have?" "Why should I be more precise? They'll cure you. They'll stop secondaries forming. You wouldn't understand if I explained. Hand over the bottle. I give you my word of honor I'll return it to you when you leave." They looked at each other. He looked really comic, ready for his walk, in his women's dressing gown and belt with the star buckle on it. She was going on and on about it. Damn the bottle. He wouldn't particularly mind handing it over. He still had 10 times that amount of Aconite stored back at home. No, the trouble really was, here was this lovely woman with the light brown eyes and radiant face, with whom it was wonderful to be talking. And yet, he would never be able to kiss her. When he got home to the backwoods, he'd hardly believe that he'd been sitting here, right next to such a radiant woman, and that she wanted to save his life, whatever the cost. That, however, was just what she couldn't do. "I'd better think twice before giving it to you," he said jokingly. "You'll take it home and someone might drink it." Who would? Who would drink it at home? She lived on her own. But it would be clumsy and inept to say so at this moment. "All right, let's call it a tie. Let's just pour it away." He started to laugh. It was a pity he couldn't do more for her than that. "All right, I'll go outside and pour it away." Say what you like, he thought. She's wrong to use lipstick. "No, I don't believe you. I'll have to be there when you do it. I've got an idea. Why pour it away? Wouldn't it be better to give it to some well-deserving fellow you are not going to cure in any case? It might do him some good." "Who have you got in mind?" Kostoglotov nodded toward Vadim Zatsirko's bed and pitched his voice even lower. "He's got a melanoblastoma, hasn't he? Now I'm really convinced we've got to pour it away, otherwise you're bound to poison someone. Bound to. How can you have that heart to suggest giving a bottle of poison to a man who's seriously ill? What if he poisoned himself? Wouldn't your conscience bother you?" She was avoiding calling him anything. Throughout their long conversation, she hadn't once called him anything. "He won't poison himself. He's a steady sort of guy." "No. Absolutely no. Come on, we'll go pour it away." "Well, I'm in a very good mood today. All right, let's go and pour it away." They walked down between the beds and out onto the landing. "Won't you be cold?" "No, I've got a cardigan underneath." She'd said cardigan underneath. Why had she said it? Now he wanted to see what sort of cardigan and what color, but he never would. They went out onto the porch. The day had brightened up. It was almost like spring. No one, recently arrived, would have believed it was only the 7th of February. The sun was shining. The high poplar branches and low hedge shrubbery were still bare, but the patches of snow had almost gone, even in the places that didn't get the sun. Between the trees lay last year's grayish-brown beaten-down grass. The pathways, the paving, the stone, and the asphalt were damp. They hadn't dried off yet. There was the usual lively traffic of people in the gardens, walking toward each other, crossing each other's paths, or overtaking. Doctors, nurses, orderlies, general, staff, outpatients and inpatients, relatives. There were even a couple of benches occupied. Here, and in the other wings, a few windows were open for the first time that year. They decided not to pour it out right in front of the porch. It would look odd. "Come on, we'll go over here." He pointed to a path that ran between the cancer wing and the ear, nose, and throat wing. It was one of the places where he took his strolls. I hope they bang. Seems like it's about to happen. I don't know. They walked side by side along a paved pathway. Gangart's doctor's cap was made like a pilot's. It just came up to Kostoglotov's shoulder. He watched her out of the corner of his eye. She was walking alone with a solemn expression, as if she was engaged in something immensely important. It made him want to laugh. "Tell me, what did they call you at school?" he asked her suddenly. She gave him a quick glance. "What's that got to do with it?" "Nothing, of course. I was just interested." She took a few more steps in silence, her feet tapping lightly against the paving stones. He had first noticed her slender, gazelle-like legs that day when he had been lying on the floor dying and she had come up to him for the first time. "Vega," she said. Of course, that wasn't really true, or not completely true. She had been called that at school, but only by one man. the educated and intelligent private who never came back from the war. On an impulse, without knowing why, she'd suddenly confided that nickname to someone else. They came out of the shadow and onto the walk between the two wings. The sun hit them. A little breeze was blowing there. Vega, after the star, but Vega should be dazzlingly white. They stopped. I'm not dazzlingly... Fuck, I can't say that word. I'm not dazzling or anything. She shook her head. But I am Vera Gangart. That's all it is. Basically, that's just her name separated to where the letters match up to make it an acronym if you cut both of her first and last name in half. For the first time, it wasn't she who was embarrassed at something he'd said, but the other way around. What I meant was, he began, in an attempt to justify himself. Wait, how is he embarrassed? Oh. Vega after the star. Should have dazzlingly what? Stop. I'm not dazzling or anything. She shook her head. But I am Vera Gangart. That's all it is. For the first time, it wasn't she who was embarrassed at something he'd said, but the other way around. What I meant was, he began, in an attempt to justify himself. I quite understand. Pour it away, now, she ordered. She didn't even permit herself a smile. Kostoglotov loosened the firmly wedged cork, extracted it with great care, then bent down. He looked absurd, with the shirt-like dressing gown over his boots, and pulled up one of the little stones left over from when the path was last paved. Watch me. Otherwise you'll say I poured it into my pocket, he said. He was squatting on the ground, close to her legs. Those legs. Those gazelle-like legs. He'd noticed them that first time. He poured someone's murky brown liquid death, or recovery, into the small damp hole in the dark soil. May I put the stone back? He asked. She looked down at him and smiled. There was something boyish in the way he poured the stuff away and put back the stone. It was boyish, but a bit like making a vow, too, or sharing a secret. Well, congratulate me, he said, getting up from the ground. Congratulations, she smiled, but sadly. Go for your stroll now. And she walked off back to the wing. He stared at her white back. The two triangles, upper and lower. Any sign of feminine interest stirred him now. He read more than there was into every word, and after every action, he waited for the next. Vega. Vera Gangart. There was something that didn't quite fit. But for the moment, he couldn't work out what. He stared at her back. Vega! Vega! He said, half loud, trying to suggest it to her from a distance. Come back, do you hear? Come back! Please turn round. But the suggestion failed. She did not turn. That concludes chapter 17. And I did not predict the outcome of that chapter. It's getting good. He's the most eligible bachelor in the cancer ward, and he's due to get some any time now, it seems. Not that that's why we're reading this, but it's getting pretty juicy. And there are, 32 chapters. No, there's 36. We're halfway through. We're officially halfway through Cancer Ward. Wow. Well, thanks for tuning in, and I will see y'all tomorrow. But by now, Kostoglotov had noticed that he was spoiling his own case, so he stopped.